The Misfits. The people with opinions and the stories behind them. Argue with them. Disagree with them. If you're brave enough, listen to them. The people who think differently don't just shape conversations. They disrupt them. Because the Misfits aren't rare. They're among us.
Some people spend their lives trying to be heard. Others spend their lives learning how to listen. Today's guest has spent decades doing exactly that. Charlie is a long-time Edward R. Murrow Award-winning Chicago journalist. He's been an anchor. He's been a reporter for the Gone But Not Forgotten VXRT FM news team, director of the former WNUA-FM. Give me the call sign.
WNUA 95.5, smooth jazz for Chicago. Which I did. That wasn't my job to say that at the radio station.
Doesn't matter. It was, dude, that hit. He was a columnist. He was an editor of the Chicago Tribune, founding head of news at audio production company Rivet 360, founder of the free Chicago Public Square email newsletter, which we want all of our listeners to go out and get. Someone who spent years observing, interpreting, and helping tell the story of Chicago. And beyond the titles, he's someone who's built a lens on people, power, narrative, what shapes the way we understand the world around us. Because when you spend enough time listening closely, you start to see the differences between the stories people hear and the truth underneath it. Charlie, welcome to Misfits Among Us. I am so happy you're here today.
I'm honored to be here. I'm going to have a hard time living up to that introduction, Joey.
No. Impossible. Here's the difference. I think I've been lucky enough to interview, and I am interviewing now more and more very interesting people. I think a lot of their interesting stories happen to be newer. I think a lot of their interesting stories they're beginning to build their path. You've been on this path, and you've seen Chicago shift and change, become what it is today, which we know is not going to be stagnant because it's changing all the time. I'm super interested to hear how you got into this news radio thought space. How did this happen?
You know, you go all the way back. On my Facebook page and social media in 1962. At the age of 7, I created a little newspaper called the Beanie Copter News, which was delivered by Beanie Copter, which will probably mean nothing to you. But back in the day, the Beanie was a kid's cartoon created by Bob Clampett, who was, one of the pioneering animators of the mid 20th century. And Beanie was Cecil the seasick sea serpent, little boy chum. And Beanie had a beanie copter, a beanie that he wore on his head, and a little propeller that was on top of his beanie. And he could pull a string, and the propeller would fly off and do great things. There was a Mattel toy called the Beanie Copter. You can Google the Beanie Copter ad and see Mattel selling this thing. In the middle of the little propeller was a little compartment. You could open up and you put secret messages or very tiny toys and deliver them from one end of the living room to the other. And I created the Beanie Copter News. It was a one-page thing, and hi, I am the editor of the Beanie Copter News. My first day on the paper. Again, I'm 7, so it's not spelled very well. This was inspired in part by the fact that my dad was a newspaper man, and my mom was a newspaper columnist on occasion. And so, I had journalism in the family, and it was an inspiration to go into journalism. For a time, I thought maybe I'd be an astronaut, as we all did in the mid-'60s. Over the course of time, as I grew up, that I wasn't going to be an astronaut. But I saw Jules Bergman, who was an ABC television reporter on the front lines of every space launch, talking to astronauts. And so I thought, I can't be an astronaut, but at least I can talk to astronauts. I did get to interview people close to the space program, including Jim Lovell, the late Jim Lovell, commander of the Apollo 13 mission. Cool thing about being a journalist, as I learned over the course of the years, working on my high school paper and then working for the college radio station at the University of Illinois, is when you're a journalist, declare yourself a journalist or a reporter, you could talk to anybody anywhere. You could at least ask to talk to anybody anywhere, as you know from your experience here. And so the joy of being a journalist is you get to talk to people and ask questions. And as my family is tired of hearing me say, I'm really good at questions, I suck at answers.
I'm glad you're a guest.
It's a great profession for a journalist.
You remind me a little bit of Richard Branson when he was young. He started this student magazine in college, and this was his first forte into media. He really attributes to kind of who he is today. You had this little newsletter you made when you were 7. And interestingly, talk about bookends. You have a newsletter now that you release And you've really not got away from this grassroots way of connecting and everything in between, which has been the radio, the news, everything else almost feels like it's been filler to doing what you really love, which is releasing information. Am I right? Am I not right?
I've said on occasion over the years that I may really have only had one good idea in my career, and it's not even an original idea. It's see what other people are saying and reporting about the news, and then share it with other people. I mean, what does a radio newscaster do? Certainly, what did I do in my first really big radio news job? 10 years at WXRT. You get in the morning. You look at the newspapers. I would literally circle things with a highlighter or tear them out and make a pile of them. Say, okay, this is going to go in a newscast. This is going to go in a newscast. Then you look at the wire machine. For you young people, we had a teletype, which is sort of a magic typewriter that just nonstop around the clock was printing out news.
You're
And
using
it was
words that I don't even know what they mean.
in the early days. The teletype was, if you've ever seen a typewriter with keys that go back and forth, I mean, it literally was a typewriter that was typing character by character. As time went by, it became a dot matrix printer, which would just go line by line and print out the letters in a series of dots. But it was nonstop turning out news. And I'd look at those. Anyone doing newscasts would look at those. And we say, okay, we're taking this wire story, this newspaper story. We had at WXRT and at many of the stations I worked, we had reporters, small staff in most cases for FM news, who would go out and cover City Hall, a role that I later played myself. And we'd mix in those reports with wire stories and the Tribune's reporting, the Sun-Times is reporting, etc. And the thing about radio news is still every word counts. You're given a time limit and you got to be done so that things can hit right at the top of the hour or at 15 minutes after the hour or whatever.
Driven by advertising, right? Nothing's
Driven
changed.
by advertising. So it reinforced and sort of made innate for me the primary rule of Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, great book on writing. White there is E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little, Trumpet of the Swan. And that rule is omit needless words. So, removing that when you don't need that. Using contractions on radio, very important. Not only to save time, but also because it sounds more natural when you write with contractions. So as the internet unfolded, and I'm jumping ahead to 1998 when I joined the Chicago Tribune, when they were just trying to figure out what's happening with breaking news on the internet. And fortunately for me, the powers that be said, yeah, it might be good to have a radio guy in the mix as we kind of figure out what happens to news between press runs of the newspaper. This whole business of omitting needless words became very important in the fight for reader attention on the internet, in email, in subject lines, in headlines. It's a part and parcel of what radio news people do, but has become essential in the internet age, when everybody is competing for everyone's attention all at once, from all the media all at once. Everybody's on your phone, not just radio, not just music, not just podcasts, but TV stations and Snapchat and all the rest.
It's interesting to kind of see where things have gone, because if you think about it from what you did, you were essentially early Twitter, right? You only had a certain number of characters to use. You had to make sure that you refine. And look, I understand that it's a stretch, but truthfully, for a long time,
there's a point to this, yeah.
While Twitter, which I think the value has diminished, but I do think at some point in time, Twitter was the place where people went. You had X amount of characters, 140 characters or whatever it was. That's where you got your information. And people loved the idea of these, which I think plays into kind of where people are going. My kids, they're on their phones, going through all these videos constantly. And it's this idea of these quick wins. The quick win was what gave you the value and the importance.
In my consulting work, which I did quite a bit of in the early part of the last decade, I was in a position to bring home the fact that all of us, are in a fight for the audience's attention. And every word matters, and especially in the world of subject lines and in tweets or X's or blue sky, getting the most interesting word first. It needs to be part of the way we all think, in headlines, in social media posts.
What are you thinking about all of this as you're looking at how communication and messaging is getting out now?
Well, I go back to my radio years when, doing the news on music stations put news people in the position of interrupting the main reason, or one of the main reasons, that people were listening to a radio station. And the thing that was pounded into many a radio news person on a music station in particular was, and I'm paraphrasing a program director or five, don't you be a fucking tune out. And don't you be the reason that someone punches the dial to go somewhere else. I mean, the point that I tried to hammer home was everyone now lives in the world that radio news used to live in. You know, someone driving their car, you got a bunch of buttons back then. When, you know, as soon as you heard something you didn't like, you could punch the dial and go somewhere else, turn, punch a button, whatever. That's a world that we now all live in because we're all in a digital space. It's something that back in the days when we had 3 TV networks and maybe 2 or 4 newspapers, you didn't have another choice. You could not just instantly switch from one newspaper to another. And you had a limited number of choices on the TV dial. You could go somewhere else. Now, all of this becomes even more intense, and not just for people in the media, not just for news people. It becomes more intense for people in all forms of communication. And, you know, as I've said, everybody now is competing with everyone all at once. It's not the world where you get a morning newspaper at, 6 o'clock in the morning, and that's really your only source of news, except maybe for a break-in on the radio. Mm-hmm. And then you get an afternoon paper or an afternoon newscast. Now it's coming at everybody all at once, and everybody in the communications business, which is all of us, because we're all communicators now to everyone else. We are constantly in a struggle to gain and maintain the attention of the people we want to communicate with.
On any social media, and I go on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, are 50% of the stories fake? Truth is different than what it was.
Well, let me put it this way. It was harder back then to tell if you were being handed a lie. And I'm thinking back to the Vietnam War. There were a limited number of sources of information. And, back in the day, newspapers and the handful of TV networks and channels and radio stations were the only source of information we had. And they were in business in large part to sell advertising. And so to sell that advertising, they were, to some extent, it became a business imperative not to piss off too many people on one side or the other. We want to be a place where everybody comes together. So there was an institutional reluctance, and I speak from some experience, not to rock the boat. To, so-and-so says this, so-and-so says this, our job's done.
Push enough. You're pushing enough, but you're not going too hard.
A reluctance to call out lies and liars, because that just is going to annoy some non-trivial percentage of our audience, and we want to keep the biggest possible audience. As media has splintered, some academicians have referred to the age of mass media, roughly 1955 to 1995. That's the rise of the TV networks to the rise of the internet. In those years, there were relatively few number of news sources, and they were by and large controlled by older white men. And so minority and non-male viewpoints were given secondary status. There were, women's columnists, for instance, and as we went by, perhaps people whose beat was covering minority groups. The truth was in some ways harder to ascertain back then because there was a reluctance to rock the boat. Now it's harder to ascertain the truth because there are so many sources and everybody has a megaphone now. So it requires news consumers to be more circumspect. A plug here for the News Literacy Project, nonprofit that has great guides to help people figure out, is this true? Is this source reliable? What do I look for? And one of the things that I encourage people to look for as they're assessing the source of information is, does the site do corrections? Does it have an email address or a website where you can report problems? Does it list bylines? Are those bylines linked to biographies of people whose identities you can check? If you're on social media, are they using what looks like a real name or are they using a made-up name? Doesn't mean they're lying one way or another. In some cases, especially now, communicators may feel a reason to protect their identity from repercussion from an oppressive federal government. You got to do your homework. You can't just say, okay, well, it's in the paper. It's got to be true, which may not have been true back in the day either.
Do you think that where we are now is better or worse than where we were? You're able to look at it from a point of view to say, I've seen this shift in terms of how people are approaching news, how people are approaching the media, looking back to when it was on radio, TV, now within the internet space. And because again, look, we're entering this age of AI. We're letting systems think for us. And you're sitting there saying, well, at some point in time, are we relying more on technology and these quick little wins versus really sitting there saying, like, we should get our hands dirty and we should, scuff up our knees and we should be the ones to really figure this out. How are you seeing the shift now in terms of where you've been?
I'll tell you, at one point, probably 20 years ago, I remember telling my family, my three sons who were probably at home then, the internet makes everything better. And I believed that at the time. It made things like home repair easier. You could find out how to fix a doorknob. It made it easier for journalists who are between jobs to communicate, to do their work. I mean, and that is still the case. But clearly the internet is, it depends who's in charge of the internet and what companies are making decisions about what happens on the internet. So I have to retract that remark at this point. I don't know if we're better or worse. In a lot of ways, and let's take AI as an example. I'm torn on this. I use AI throughout the day in the form of Grammarly, which corrects my typos. It helps me be a better writer in some ways. It's the editor that I don't have anymore because I'm doing Chicago Public Square all by myself. And there's something to be said for AI writing guidance for people who are reporting in a language that may not be their native language. If it helps someone who wasn't born in the United States write better English and communicate, to go out and report and gather facts and do honest journalism, but then helps them take those facts and craft them into a piece that reads better than it might have otherwise, that's a good thing. But we all have to treat AI with kid gloves at this point because, as I think has been well documented, it can hallucinate. AI agents need to be treated as a smart intern whose work needs to be checked and double checked at every turn. That said, it can be very, very helpful for people who don't have the resources, for instance, to hire a computer coder. And this is bad news for computer coders. And I went to Microsoft's agent Copilot and said, take a look at this page of code and this page of code and tell me what's wrong with this page and how can I make this page look like this page. And it took a lot, but eventually I think it gave me a solution. It seems to be working so far. And I'm sorry for all my friends in the coding business, just as I'm sorry for a lot of friends who, whose other jobs are being disrupted by AI. To take that kind of power and put it in the hands of people who don't work for big corporations and don't have friends who know how to code is potentially an empowering thing. I'm hoping for the best. It also clearly is something that could be used for evil purposes, and we've seen some of that.
Everything's shifting, but journalism itself is not what journalism was. And if you look
true.
at a number of, right, you look at a number of people in university who are using AI to kind of write their stories or write their work, knowing that, joke's on them, knowing that when they get out of university, AI might be doing their job for them, right?
Yeah. At this point, at least until we have robots that are capable of going out and doing this stuff, there is still something to be said for having a human at the scene of an event
I agree.
to talk to people. But even in ancient times, you'd often have a reporter at the scene getting quotes and calling into the newsroom and dictating, oh, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, and someone at the other end would actually write the story. So the fact that AI might now fill that role means that in some ways we're returning to the time where most recently a single reporter, once we had computers and the ability to file separately, was doing all of that. But yeah, you still need a human to do some original reporting. On the other hand, as you may know, AI increasingly can be useful for small news organizations, especially for small news organizations in news deserts where there are no newspapers and a single newspaper is now covering multiple communities and doesn't have enough reporters to go everywhere all at once, where municipal or governmental meetings are being recorded and transcribed by machine language. It makes it a little easier for a reporter to go in and cover those events, even though the reporter wasn't there. And those transcriptions, again, are generated by machine. And the next step is, in some cases, you can ask an artificial intelligence agent to say, okay, give me highlights of this meeting. Now, a good reporter will go back and look at the actual transcript and check that. But, if it makes reporting available to people who wouldn't get any reporting at all, that's a plus. I will say I did read an interesting story recently about a teacher who, to short circuit students' use of AI, is making students do their writing on typewriters to see if they actually can write and say things that are in their head. And so my small collection of typewriters may be increasing in value.
Do you think people are still looking for truth? Or do you think they just want to be able to see reinforcement for what they heard? Because I think there's two different paths here. It's not always about the newest information. It's about if this person just agrees with me, right? Social media, you follow the people who theoretically agree. I usually don't, but you follow the people who agree with you. It reinforces your own beliefs, whether those beliefs are right or wrong or whatever it might be. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's fair.
No, I honestly, it'd be easy to stereotype and say some people on this side really just want reinforcement of their beliefs, and some people on this side are absolutely seeking the truth. My inclination in this particular political milieu in which we find ourselves is that many of the president's followers are not particularly interested in the truth. And by truth, I mean scientifically verified evidence of things. But there's plenty of hope unjustified by the facts at the other end of the political spectrum too. The Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics says that journalists' number one job is to seek the truth and report it. The truth is a difficult thing, and it's a never-ending process. As scientists know, I mean, everything is subject to questioning. Things that we accept as truth one day may prove not to be true the next year or the next decade.
What concerns you most about where media is heading today?
I'm concerned, but also hopeful. It is certainly sad to see some behemoths of journalism, proprietors of excellent journalistic work, be diminished. My friends at the Chicago Tribune, where again I spent 11 years, are still doing wonderful work, but they are a much, much smaller staff than they were before. And they can't do what was done at the early part of this century, this millennium. The Washington Post, of course, has been compromised by Jeff Bezos's ownership. These are all sad things, and I'm concerned about them. On the other hand, what we see if we look, and I don't think the story's been completed yet, we see journalists who have been set loose by some of these corporate organizations, including TV networks, starting up their own media organizations, which is something that could not have been done in the middle of the last century or before. Again, as I've taught journalism over the years, I've told students, when I got out of college, if you wanted to share anything with a lot of people who weren't your relatives and didn't live within shouting distance of your home, you had to be hired by someone who owned a printing press or had acquired a broadcast license. And that was pretty much it. The internet has now created a culture in which anyone with anything to say anywhere has the potential to communicate with the entire world for free. I mean, you can start up a blog for free, which I did. Sign up free, sub.chicagopublicsquare.com. And that's hopeful. So we have a multiplicity of voices out there. The downside, as we've discussed, is, everyone everywhere has a voice. And it means that those of us who are looking for truth have to do a lot more homework to figure out which of, these voices in the cacophony are people we want to follow. Being in a democracy is not easy.
You've touched on voice a lot. So did your relationship with your voice in terms of what you went through, did this shift a lot over the years? Or do you feel you kind of were always like this? Like what did that journey look like for you?
I remember a turning point in my radio career when I realized that I didn't have to sound quite so formal. And it was, frankly, watching David Letterman and seeing that he was comfortable with messing up and backing up and saying it again. And he wasn't the first to do that, but he was influential on me. And on the radio at WXRT at the time, it made me a lot more comfortable with, okay, I'm going to try harder to be more human in the way I talk. And again, more contractions, more trying harder to write the way I talk. And I think that it's a style thing, but I think it rewards, especially now. And I think you see it in, I hate this word. I don't say I hate it. I don't like influencers and their influence. They are doing what, I flatter myself, but what I kind of decided to do at some point in my career, in that they're just talking to people. They are not saying the president reported today. They are not saying Pope Leo the 13th. It is 13th, right? They're just saying Pope Leo. They're not saying President Donald J. Trump. They're saying President Trump or Trump. And those conventions of broadcast journalism and print journalism, to some extent, create a barrier between journalists, reporters, communicators, and the people with whom they want to communicate, because it says we are formal and we are restrained in some way, and we're not giving it to you straight. So finding that right mix of authenticity, voice, and responsibility to seek the truth is the magic that I think all journalists should be trying to mix together into a winning formula.
Now, I would say very much with influencers behind the scenes, they're cutting deals with every single brand. They're getting greased by everybody. The good ones, these big influencers who are sitting there saying, I don't care about this coffee mug brand, but you know what? They're going to give me $1 million and now I'm only going to drink the coffee mug brand. And I'm going to say that I love it. And this is not that people weren't greased back in the day, but it's different.
I have two minds on that. One is disclosure counts for a lot. The other is, let's go back again to the last century when newspapers would run full-page ads for businesses. If you think that those full-page ads, which brought in a lot of money, didn't at least make publishers and editors think a couple of times about how they'd report on those companies, then I think you're fooling yourself. Again, the best news organizations had a church-state wall. Editorial doesn't talk to sales. And as news organizations have shrunk, that wall has become more porous. But disclosure, I think, counts for a lot. I think that in a story on an advertiser who is a big advertiser in a newspaper, it would not be inappropriate for a newspaper or a newspaper website to say, this organization, which, by the way, paid our company X million dollars last year for advertising, blah, 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 blah. I think that we could do more of that in the traditional media than has been the case. I give credit to those who disclose, I'm getting $1 million to drink from this mug.
I just want to argue that, historically that might be going to the business, but it wasn't going to the journalist. Now in this influencer setting, it's going to essentially what is the journalist. So instead of me running an ad and me doing a story, and granted, most likely my story is not going to say this company is shit. And oh, by the way, we're running an ad for the company right next to the story. But now we're only going to say that this company is good, and we're never going to give a non-biased approach.
It's a problem. And I would discount the value and reliability of someone who makes that kind of disclosure, which I give them some credit for. It's a reason that in Chicago Public Square, I do not run sponsorships. Sponsorships to me say, hey, they're directing content. They are approving content. I'll run ads if someone wants. And the difference between an ad and a sponsorship in my mind is an ad is a company or corporation or individual saying, you have a big audience. I want your audience. I want to talk to your audience. Let me do that. But they aren't going to control what happens editorially.
I'm not going to influence anything.
I'm not going to influence anything. So I resist sponsorship, and you'll see ads that are presented as advertorial. They look like editorial content, and they may or may not be labeled as such. Again, in looking for things, and this is the News Literacy Project, kind of approach to verifying news media, you want to look for a code of ethics on your websites or from people whom you are trusting for news. Do they have a code of ethics that says we will not be influenced by advertising? Do they say we accept money from this organization? And if they don't have such a policy, it's a reason to question what they do and how they do it.
You're a wealth of knowledge that we take for granted today. And I say that acknowledging that you've been able to move the needle through all different types of media. And at the same time, you've seen growth, you've seen shrinkage, you've seen things change, and you've lived through a time when news was still, as much as it could be, governed by truth and need and value, not who owns our newspaper. They're going to be dictating what stories that we can write. You turn on any news station today, 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, we're doing a story on this. And oh, by the way, it's owned by this corporation, Disney, Fox, whatever, if Fox is even around, Disney, Amazon, whatever it might be. But I guarantee a lot of newspapers, one in particular, is not going to sit there and say, Amazon's laying off all these people in a horrible way. They don't want to, keep people employed over a certain age. They are not a good company to work with because, it turns out that company decides to own our newspaper. They don't have that freedom anymore. Where historically, you saw a lot more of that freedom, and it's getting, in Western society, we should be able to say what we want to say in a news environment, right? But a lot of this now is changing. The grasp is tightening. I feel more now than ever, just by virtue of these billionaires are getting richer and richer and taking over, and rightfully so. They're playing the right card hand here, right? They're saying, if we want to make sure that we can decide what messaging needs to be said, we're going to start owning more and more and more of whatever media we can, right? Like, Musk was smart to say, I'm taking Twitter. Whether Twitter exists or doesn't exist, it's not negatively going to impact him. Financially, maybe, but it shouldn't, hopefully, from messaging, right? So you've seen this. Is this, do you agree? Is this on par with kind of where things are going?
Since 2016 in particular, I don't make predictions anymore.
Probably safe.
I don't think journalists should make predictions. I encourage people to skip over headlines in the news that say such and such could, because it also means could not, or such and such may, because it also means may not. If they don't have something solid to report, that's an article that's probably not worth reading if you're interested in facts. So I don't make predictions anymore. I think much of what you say is true. I do want to give nod to the Washington Post reporters who, over the years, and I haven't seen it lately, but that doesn't mean it's not happening, have done a disclosure. By the way, Washington Post is owned by Bezos, who owns Amazon. But yeah, no, there's no question at this point, given a Trump-compliant Federal Communications Commission, that, oligarchs are taking over the media. I mean, you don't have to look any farther than CBS, Paramount, maybe Warner. They're all in a position to bend a knee to President Trump.
I mean, essentially, it seems like, especially with the age of AI, to just keep their job, right? I think this is just coming back to something very simplistic. I know so many people that are laid off. I know so many people that don't have homes right now or had to leave and go move back in with their parents, or who knows.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people there are fighting to say, whatever I got to do to keep this up, I'm willing to do these days. And the problem is, I'm not. I know other people that aren't. But who knows where that's going to go, right? Who knows where that's going to end? I would say 99.99% of everything Trump has done, I can't stand. There might be one thing that I don't know if I value or might not bother me as much.
Well, he did preside over a successful space mission, whether he gets credit for it or not. I'll give him, people he has running the government, that. So what I'm doing with Chicago Public Square these days is, as my wife and others have put it, I'm reading the news so you don't have to. And Chicago Public Square would be nothing if not for the great journalism being done by people, not just in Chicago, but in the nation's capital, around the country and around the world. And all I'm doing, I don't like the phrase curating. I still think of it as a newscast, even though I'm not talking into a microphone every day. But I'm rounding up the news and putting it in a form that I hope will keep people engaged, interested, and ideally, because this is part of my mission, will get them to click and go read in depth the great work being done by so many people who are still, even now, doing great reporting.
Do you have favorite reporters out there now?
I love them all.
Or is it more about the story? Okay.
It's more about the story. Anyone who reads Chicago Public Square will know there are certain columnists whose work I point to more than others here in Chicago. Eric Zorn and Neil Steinberg. Zorn, a former Tribune columnist who has set out, I flatter myself, in the email newsletter space. He had a newsletter at the Tribune, but he's gone independent and very successfully. Far more readers than I have, by the way. And Neil Steinberg, who is still a Sun-Times columnist, but has committed to posting an email newsletter in the name of his blog every goddamn day. That is the name of his blog, every goddamn day. And, on a national scene, I've become a fan of Jeff Tiedrick. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who has a piece called Everyone is Entitled to My Own Opinion. That's his blog. And he is profane, incredibly blunt, and amusing. And another staple of Chicago Public Square coverage is seeing what the late night hosts have to say, because they are still, despite everything, the truth tellers of our time. After Trump's first election and after his second election, my nightmares really, were consumed for weeks on end with the prospect that he would shut them down. And we got through the first term without that happening. The second term, those nightmares
they're very much becoming a reality. I agree.
With Kimmel yanked briefly, but still back, and with Colbert now approaching the end of his run there, more than almost anything else Trump has done. And I need to put an asterisk by this horrific war that he's launched.
I agree.
But certainly domestically, as much as anything else, his curtailing of those voices gives me great reason for concern about the future of democracy. So there are often links to them. They are also my favorites.
Ring your own bell for a minute. Favorite stories you've done over the years?
Well, I won you mentioned the Edward R. Murrow Award, which I did with our startup Rivet, now Rivet 360, which was an idea to reinvent radio for the smartphone. Some people refer to it as Pandora for radio news. Another friend very cleverly referred to it as Tinder for radio news, because if you liked what you were listening, you could swipe right and listen to it again. And if you didn't like it, you could swipe left and you're on to the next story. Great idea. Sort of reinvent radio news for the smartphone. Gathering an audience and bringing in revenue proved not as easy as we had hoped. And Rivet 360 still doing wonderful award-winning and award-nominated work, up for a Lissagore Award from the Chicago Headline Club this year for podcast creation. And I'm still of counsel. I'm the kind of the nagger in chief. I refer to myself that way. But when we were in the thick of creating, just pounding one news story after another into this app, the idea was you turn it on, you get the latest news, you get an AP network newscast, and then you'd have one interesting story after another from RT. And we were working 24/7, almost 24/7. And one night, a couple of members of our team were working there, and one of our glass desks exploded. Just instantaneously shattered into a zillion pieces. And I took it on myself to create a report about this, which apparently is not incredibly uncommon, and brought in a structural engineer to talk about what had happened. And we walked around the office and had my teammates sort of record in first person what happened. We posted a story called "Our Glass Desk Exploded, Yours Could Too." And that went on to win regional and then a national Edward R. Murrow Award. So that was a fun story. And
isn't it funny how the most trivial things end up becoming so fantastic? I mean, it's not always about the biggest, the biggest story. Unbelievable.
Yeah. That was great fun. Going back from before Rivet to the very short-lived FM News Chicago, which was a brief attempt to sort of rethink all news radio in a slightly more hip format for the FM dial on the frequency that then, and I guess now again, is WKQX, an alternative rock station. But for a year, almost a little less than a year, we were kind of rethinking everything. And my job there was as news chief, the Chicago bureau chief for FM News. And so I was at City Hall day in and day out, and I covered Rahm Emanuel's first year as mayor. And we had a lot of fun, and I did a series of reports called "Who's Mayor Emanuel Ridiculing Now?" in which, I mean, he was merciless at news conferences. If someone asked a question that he thought was stupid, he would make nonstop fun of them for a minute or two. And I would take these pieces, including at least one time when he made fun of me, and I deserved it. I've shared many of these on the web. There's a collection called My Year of Rahm, which kind of feels like ancient history, but with talk that he may be running for president. I will be flashing back to some of those in the days and months to come if he does. And then going back further into my time at WXRT, 1979 to 1989, we won some awards for investigative reporting, including a series I did on some potential conflicts of interest at the school board, which had no ethics policy at the time in terms of what school board members could do and how they could do it and where they could get money. And that resulted in part in state legislation to kind of reform that aspect of school governance in Chicago. But the real fun is day in and day out. Hey, here's something interesting for you. Here's something interesting for you. And that whole process of reading the news so other people don't have to is where I get joy, which is why in 2017, when Donald Trump had first been elected, and, as we've all gotten used to it now, but in those first days of that first Trump administration, news was coming at you everywhere at once. He was disrupting everything everywhere. And a friend wrote me a note and said, "I can't keep track of it. Do you know anyone who's rounding this up?" And I had a little more time on my hands because Rivet had scaled down, the news operation. And I said, "Oh, you know what? I can do that. That is how Chicago Public Square was born. I can round up the news. I'm a newscaster at heart." And so that's what happens almost every day at chicagopublicsquare.com. Subscribe, sub.chicagopublicsquare.com. It's free.
It will be linked. It'll be linked in all of the show notes. I fully agree. Subscribe for it. I don't think I think stuff like this, the value of it is you're getting a wealth of knowledge, whether you agree or you disagree with it. I don't think it's important. I don't think that's the reason. I think you're reading it and you're really making your own choice in terms of what you believe, but you're not getting it on this national front that I'm kind of bored with at this point. I don't care about the Fox Newses, the CNNs. These stories don't matter to me anymore. I think they're so overly polished. It just doesn't fit my life. Your news stories that you release, I think, are a lot more timely and mean a lot more to me personally because you're curating them. And just to let everybody know kind of how I found you, because you even said, like, why the hell are you emailing me? Yeah, right. How? So I was doing some research. I moved to Chicago 4+ years ago, and I've always been really just interested in people's journey and their experience in terms of how they've gone through their life and what that looked like. And I love the idea of people having these unique paths that up until recently, where everybody was laid off, everybody kind of did the same thing. You know, you went and worked for a big business and maybe you went to university, you came out, you had this job, maybe you had 2 jobs. Having 1 job or 2 jobs now, it's a fallacy. You need many through your life. It's never about doing the 1 or 2 things anymore. Unlike, my mother, why don't you just have 1 job? I had 1 job my whole life. Well, it's not how life works anymore. I'm sorry. And you kept on coming up in my Google searches in terms of just,
Dude, what were you searching? What were you searching?
Strange newsmen in Chicago? No, it was just voices of Chicago and voices of radio. And I wanted to learn more about just the Chicago infrastructure because look, I'm from Michigan. So Chicago to me has never been, I lived in New York and whatnot, but Chicago to me always felt like Michigan. I would come here all the time. I would drive in, I would visit friends. This wasn't like an experience. This was just another place you went. And now living here, learning more and more about it, it's such a unique place. I mean, again, you've seen so many changes in Chicago.
I think anyone who lives to be my age, which is 71 at this point, has seen a lot of changes. And technology in particular means the changes are only going to accelerate. So you have seen a lot of changes in Chicago in your 4 years here. I mean, let's face it. Yeah.
But here's my argument. Here's my argument though, right? I lived here a number of years ago. I remember when Caprini Green was still here. I remember there's been a lot of different mayors that have been here, but look, Chicago's been on the forefront of technology, apps, moving the needle, entrepreneurship. I mean, you just don't see this the same way. Food, you don't see this the same way in all other states. And even New York, it's very different. So you've seen this tangential shift.
Chicago has, I think, aptly been named the most American of American cities in that in many ways it reflects the entire nation better than many a city does in terms of its demographics, its economy, et cetera. And I think that's right. But, since you mentioned Michigan, I should, I think it's part of my story. I was born in Michigan too and spent my first 13 years in Michigan.
Where?
St. Clair Shores, Michigan.
Was it far where I grew up? I grew up in the border of Southfield, Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
I was just Metro Detroit, man.
Southfield was where the cool kids lived. My dad took a new job in 1968, moving from the community college, Macomb County Community College, Reagan-ish kind of county. I'm not sure how the politics are swaying nowadays. Anyway, we moved from Detroit, outside Detroit, to outside Chicago, Orland Park, and I hated it. I was 13. This is 1968, August 8th, 1968. A date burned into my brain. Just days before, the Chicago Democratic Convention gave this city a black eye that lingers to this day. And just months before my dad's beloved Detroit Tigers won the pennant. And I was merciless with my dad, who deserved far better, Do you see what you did? You made us move from Michigan to Illinois, and look what's happening in Chicago, and look what we're missing in Detroit.
But where was the love, though? Where did that shift come to where you were like, wait, I now really love? Because look, you haven't left. You've been here a long time now.
I'm not. Anyone who's born in Chicago will tell you I'm not a native Chicagoan because I don't say Chicago like that.
Chicago.
Where did the love come? Well, probably once I was at the University of Illinois, discovering the joys of radio journalism and being on the radio. But, I met my wife in 1978, and it was, and that would not have happened if my dad had not moved us here. We met in a traffic accident. That traffic accident would not have happened if I had not been driving in Naperville at the time. And all the wonderful things that have come from that marriage, including my children and grandchildren, would not have happened had my dad not forced me to move from Michigan to Illinois.
To Chicago. Yeah, to Illinois.
Chicago,
God.
So that's, the love gradually evolved, but that certainly cemented the fact that the state has been very good to me.
I don't know. I keep on going back to this, and I do think that you've shaped public conversation. You're very, very humble. You're very, very humble.
I have a lot of reasons to be humble, believe me.
You can. And you should be.
As my family knows, when it comes to humility, I am the best.
It's you. Whether you want to agree or disagree, I do think that you shaped public conversation. I do think that you very much are an explorer. I do think that you've kept it up. I do think you have all these great memories and you've done so much, but your swan song, whether we want to agree or disagree, I think your swan song, the Chicago Public Square, is something that you love. You love Chicago Public Square. And I hope everybody goes in. I hope everybody goes and registers and gets the newsletter. I think I could be wrong, but it sounds like, because whenever you've spoken about it on this interview or I've talked about you talked to you privately, you seem happier when you speak about it. It's your baby. You're seeing it grow.
You know, as I've told my wife, I mean, the joy of this, which I hope others have a chance to experience in this new media landscape of ours, is, first of all, I miss editors. I miss colleagues. I miss having an office to some extent, but I love being my own boss. I never really wanted to be managing other people. And truth be told, I don't think I was very good at it those few times I did it. It's so much better just to manage myself. The flip side of it is, as I often tell my wife, is that I now work for an asshole who doesn't give me any time off. I have to beg him to let me take a vacation. He's a driven person. It's hard to take a break.
I want to thank you. I know I kind of cold emailed you, but I do look at you as being of value. And I do look at you as someone who comes from a place that not everybody comes from anymore. Right now it's different.
St. Clair Shores.
St. Clair Shores is the I was also going to say someone who's not leveraging technology and AI to do everything, but you had a way of doing it. It might, and look, nothing, not saying this isn't an ageism comment, but you grew up in a time where people had to work differently. And I think we've taken a lot of that for granted and we're finding really easy ways to kind of trim around what you had to do and make it easier. And I don't always think going at it from an easier standpoint is the right way to move forward. I think you gotta get your hands dirty. And you're someone who got your hands dirty over the years. You had to figure it out and you didn't have all the tools and you were still able to do it, which goes to show just the value that you bring.
I'll tell you though, one thing that I liked about the news business, particularly radio news, is I didn't have to get my hands dirty and I could just wear t-shirts to work every day. So,
t-shirts I got to tell you, t-shirts are the trick in life. You can do a t-shirt every day. You're the happy. That's all that I've ever said. I don't ever want a suit on again.
So, my hat's off to people who actually do get their hands dirty, doing real work, the real work of our society, people whose value we should have learned, and I hope we still celebrate in the years since the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And people who, have to put on uniforms and go to work at wherever every day. So journalism was an easy path for me, and I want to salute people who do real work in the real world.
Again, this goes back to you being humble. You do real work in the real world. And I think I know what you're trying to get out of me. You're the best, Charlie. No, I know what it is, but it's, you do it. You do it. And I'm proud. And I tip my hat to you because again, I think things are just different now and you were able to navigate this space and it's something that we're just slowly getting away from. Right. And I don't like that. And I like that you have the newsletter and I like that you're sticking with it. And I agree. Aaron Pranis is doing so much great work right now. I subscribe to his stuff. I love this stuff and I like the differences of opinions. And I do like being able to sit there now and pull up my phone and I'm sitting waiting for my kid to come from school and I'm scrolling through and reading and I'm not looking for a video or I'm not looking for something that's going to explain it to me. I'm really trying to put these pieces together myself. So I think you're a part of that. And I want to thank you. I think there's always more to a story than what makes the headline. Right. And what you've brought is a reminder of the way we tell stories and the way we listen to them. And it's been shaping everything. And Charlie, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. And as always, perfect lives do not make great stories. Misfits do. And you've been a part of it from the beginning. And you've been figuring out a way to tell those stories. So thank you.
You do me great honor. Thank you, Joey.
Thank you, Charlie. Take care.